13. Overall framework. After all that has been explored and established, it is unlikely that an open-minded inquirer will have any doubt as to the need for a renewed and detailed statement on the whole problem of external compulsion. A correct answer is possible only if the question is correctly posed, and the correct formulation of the question requires from the inquirer faithfulness and a free intensity of all the forces of the soul and spirit, and above all, the spiritually sighted love and religiously intense will. There are souls that are completely incapable of such a correct intensity, but it is for this reason that it is more sensible and honest for people of this type to admit their impotence and to remain modestly silent, without participating in the discussion of the problem. When a morally noble soul seeks through his love a religiously correct, strong-willed response to the violent pressure of an external evil, then people who are timid, insincere, indifferent, irreligious, hostile, nihilistically or relativistically inclined, believing all is relative and conditional, the weak-willed, the sentimental, the enemies of peace, those who suggest evil, such people can only interfere with this search, confusing, distorting, and leading it down false avenues. The question of the permissibility of external compulsion and suppression is posed correctly only if it is posed on behalf of the living good, historically struggling throughout the history of mankind with living evil. Is it permissible for representatives of genuine living good to mentally compel weak people in this struggle, and to physically compel and suppress the activities of wicked men, influencing their evil souls in the bodies they use to enact this evil? And if this is permissible, then to what extent, under what conditions, and in what ways? The very essence of this question already predetermines and provides the source, direction, and purpose of such interventions. They must flow from the genuine will to good. They must be directed at the self and point the coerced subject to genuine good, and they should aim to strengthen and implement good in the soul. This is the required level of investigation, below which the whole question loses its philosophical relevance and its vital significance, for it is not worth asking about what is permissible for a villain who wants to villainously entice someone else's soul to commit crimes. Nothing is allowed to him. He knows this, and therefore, without asking, he allows himself everything on his own authority. The whole question is posed not on behalf of the villain, but on behalf of the one who loves virtue and integrity, sincerely being in service to these ideals. But it is due to this that we find pointless and spiritually lifeless all attempts to divert this question away from the questioning subject, from his tasks and intentions, and that such are attempts to formally equalize good and evil, the noble fighter and the villain, by discussing their rights to compulsion and suppression. These attempts, which usually come from, in addition to sentimental people, the cowardly and indifferent, nihilists, or shameless sophists, boil down to the abolition of any method of influence originating from a spiritual source, its implementation and objectives, and further, to the condemnation of this method as such. Does it really matter who threatens whom, with what, for the sake of what, if the threat is present? To threaten under any condition is inhumane. Or else, does it really matter who imprisons and executes whom, and for the sake of what, if the detention and execution are evident? Humanity cannot be reconciled with prisons and executions. At the same time, such statements are usually pronounced in a tone that precludes objections, as if the matter could be reduced to the proclamation of some indisputable moral axiom which dispenses with all defeaters as soon as it is uttered. In fact, this imaginary axiom is the product of a lifeless spiritual and moral experience, or at best an ignorant intellect, which tries to morally regard the external as such by its technical and abstract characteristics as such. Good and evil are in fact not equivalent or equal in rights, and their living conduits, agents, and servants are similarly not equivalent or equal in rights. To call one who suppresses villainy an attacker can only come from blindness or hypocrisy, and to condemn equally the execution of a villain and the killing of a righteous martyr can only spring forth from hypocrisy or blindness. Only for a hypocrite or a blind man can George the victorious and the dragon which must be conquered appear as equals. Only a hypocrite or a blind man can, at the sight of such a feat, maintain neutrality and appeal to humanity while sheltering and waiting. It is the nature of the good itself that defines the question of the permissibility of physical compulsion and suppression, and the answer to it, for living good, living as it does in its conduits, agents, and servants, is the true source, and informs the implementation and objective of compulsion and suppression directed against villains. By their very definition, good and evil have a psycho-spiritual nature, and their whereabouts is the human soul. Therefore, the struggle against evil is a mental and spiritual process, and through this process we triumph over evil and transform it into good. That is, from the depths it transforms spiritual blindness into spiritual sight, and the power of stony hatred into the grace of acceptable love. This is the basic essence of the struggle against evil and the victory over it, and therefore every measure directed against evil must ultimately serve this purpose, deriving meaning and significance from it. Hence why physical compulsion and suppression have never been and will never be self-sufficient means in this struggle. He who, depriving the villain of freedom or life, thinks that this is the main point and that more is not needed. He does not understand the nature of good and evil, nor does he struggle with them. He sees nothing but the external symptoms of the disease and directs his energy past the disease itself, and thus such interventions, with their superficial utility, may prove to be harmful in essence. Physical compulsion and suppression acquire all their significance only in a system of faithfully directed social education, observing the laws of spirit and love. Further, good and evil, being essentially psychospiritual values, live in man and are realized by man, and therefore enter through him into the world of body and matter. It is clear that if a person were purely spiritual and completely incorporeal, then the struggle against evil would be limited to psychospiritual efforts and achievements, and then the physical influence of the non-villain upon the villain would be impossible. But in reality, the world is arranged differently, and such a thing is quite possible. Similarly, if a person's soul was beset with evil and, possessing a body, they were deprived of the opportunity to manifest evil bodily and pour it out in an external act, or if the soul and body of man were not associated naturally in a living, organically symbolic union and could not transfer their states and changes directly to each other, then physical suppression and compulsion would disappear as unnecessary and meaningless. But in reality, the person is arranged differently. He actually pours out his inner evil into external actions, and in fact his body can transmit to his soul someone else's protest against his evil deed. And on the contrary, if man were a purely corporeal being, devoid of mind and spirit, then physical compulsion and suppression would prove to be the sole and exclusive means of combating evil. Yet in reality this is not the case. In light of this, the use of physical force in the struggle against evil is both possible and intelligible, but not exclusive and not self-sufficient. Rather, it is a secondary and subordinate means in the general system of spiritual influence and education, and moreover a means applicable within the limits of spiritual permissibility and necessity. By its very nature, it should not be applied whenever it can be applied, but only when its application becomes necessary, and in every instance in which it is not necessary, it should not be used. For the external, physical nature of a man is foreign and inadequate as compared to the desired starting point of evil. Physical compulsion and suppression deal not with the evil itself, but only with its external manifestation. They do not penetrate into the necessary depth of the bitter soul, and the level to which their positive influence reaches remains comparatively superficial, and thus they are powerless to transform evil as such, and can smother it only when spiritual transformation fails to take place, and evil manages to flow into an external act. As a means which is not self-sufficient and remains secondary and subordinate, it must conform not only with the laws of spirit and virtue, but also with the nature of the primary means and requirements of the more substantive struggle. It should be no wise encroach upon this, or replace spiritual efforts and activities with physical ones. It should by no means harm the spiritual transformation of man. Physical compulsion and suppression are extreme measures of struggle, and the scope of their application begins only where internal measures prove untenable and insufficient. The means of physical compulsion and suppression, firstly, should not attempt to evoke clarity in the person's soul, cognition, recognition, acceptance, conviction, belief, or shrift. Any such attempt is doomed to failure before it begins. At best, it forces the compelled to enter upon the path of hypocrisy, and in the worst case, it shakes the very ability to find clarity, conviction, and faith, and perhaps extinguishes this ability altogether, disfiguring a person spiritually. Imprisonment, torture, and executions are powerless to induce discretion, conviction, and belief in the soul. They can bring one only to betrayal or to petrified obstinacy, which ends with a not always meaningful martyrdom. The physical force must, under all conditions, protect the spiritual clarity of a person without stifling in him the feelings of his own spiritual dignity or rattling his confidence in himself. This is why all forms of physical compulsion that destroy the spiritual health and spiritual strength of man must be condemned and rejected. Deprivation of food or sleep, excessive forced labor, torture, incarceration among other villains, degrading treatment, etc. Secondly, Physical compulsion and suppression should not try to force a person to experience love, example personal devotion, party commitment, consent to marriage, loyalty, patriotism. Any such attempt is doomed to failure from the start. At best, the compelled will enter upon the path of lies and treachery, and in the worst case, his soul will be imbued with contempt and hatred for whoever compels him as well as the subject imposed upon him, and he will harden his heart to the extent of a total inability to love at all. Imprisonment, torture, and executions cannot provoke in the soul either love or fidelity. Love is either voluntary and sincere, or it is not. Therefore, the physical force must, in every instance, protect the person's ability to love, seeing in it the basic transforming power of life and spirit. This is why we must condemn and reject all forms of physical compulsion which embitter the person, debilitating him, and turning him towards blind hatred and vengeance. Gross or offensive treatment, depriving a prisoner of all signs of love and attention, prohibiting worship and confession, supplying him with misanthropic literature, torture and corporal punishment, etc. Finally, thirdly, physical compulsion and suppression, turning not directly to clarity and love, but to the will of man, and with the demand of self-compulsion and self-coercion, must preserve a man's willpower, without undermining and slackening it, but, on the contrary, strengthening it and promoting its spiritual education. Every form of compulsion which erodes the will, makes its own goal unattainable and becomes meaningless, for the task of compulsion is to make the use of force against a person ultimately unnecessary, and not to eliminate his ability to freely govern himself, thereby turning him permanently into an object of suppression. This is why we must condemn all forms of physical compulsion which damage rather than strengthen the will of man, forced indolence, meaningless work, the hopelessness of a life sentence, dehumanizing punishment, etc. With this we have clarified the limits within which physical compulsion and suppression become meaningful and permissible. They cannot bring to life clarity, nor love, nor spiritual wholeness, nor positive action, much less the moral and religious transformation of the soul, and wherever these forces and abilities live and operate, they become unnecessary and unacceptable. In every situation where a man is working on acquiring clarity and love and maintains self-control, where the strength of spiritually free self-government is alive within the person, and where the beginnings of honor and duty live in his soul, where the individual educates himself by the force of self-compulsion and self-coercion, where the soul is not obsessed with an animus against spirituality and love, and even where psychological compulsion from others proves sufficient, the question of physical compulsion and suppression should not even be raised, and if it is, it should be judged in the negative. So long as an appeal to the clarity and love or the beginnings of rationality and volition in a person plays its role, and until it ceases to do so, physical compulsion and suppression should not be implemented, remaining as if in reserve, for they form a substitute and replenishing reserve for the main struggle. It is clear that these means, while performing the function of reserves, should stand ready, in a certain proximity to the internal means of struggle and in subordination to them. Moreover, unlike military reserves, they must be known in advance to the enemy as a threat and sanction, and must always be brought into battle in a very measured and seasoned gradation, so that the dose of physical compulsion and suppression is always individually adapted and not excessive, neither in the sense of the form of punishment nor in the sense of its duration. Physical compulsion and suppression are principally applicable then after internal self-government has changed within a person, and there remain no spiritual or mental methods which can deter or prevent a person's anti-spiritual deeds. This means that the limit beyond which physical force becomes necessary is set negatively, both the spiritual bankruptcy of the person being corrected and the spiritually defenseless nature of the person who performs the correction. It is clear that both these preconditions not only jointly establish a terminus a quo, the limit after which admissibility and necessity materialize, but also largely determine each other. Thus, the less spiritually bankrupt the person being educated, the more spiritual possibilities exist for influencing them, and accordingly the further out the limit is removed, after which physical action is necessary. However, the educator also has little reason to refer to an objective absence of psychospiritual means, since an inappropriate reference to this absence directly reveals his own failure, and vice versa. The more indulgent, malicious, and aggressive the form of corrective action, the sooner an objective lack of spiritual and mental resources is revealed, and the sooner the hands can drop, even those of the saint. Physical force is permissible when it is necessary, but it is only necessary when psychospiritual action is insufficient, invalid, or unfeasible. The conditions which determine the physical action in the presence of an opportune moment for it are manifold and complex, and can hardly be fully enumerated. These could be, firstly, objective conditions that are not associated with either the person being compelled or with the personality of he who compels. Such are the conditions of the timing, space, and scale of any given situation. The shorter the time given for the intervening force or for preventing an act, example, 1 moment before someone fires a gun, the further the distance separating the intervening agent from the attacker, example, a telegram ordering the arrest of a villain as the only course of action. The broader the composition of the object of the intervention, example, the need for a rapid and vigorous influence on a crowd, on an army, on the population of an occupied territory, the less feasible are the internal measures of struggle, and the sooner their inexpediency, perhaps their complete hopelessness, is revealed. They can also be, secondly, subjective conditions, connected either with the personality of the compelled or with the personality of he who compels. The lower the general spiritual quality of the compelled, example, the mental underdevelopment or moral stupidity of a person, his obscurity, ignorance, the frenzy of crowds, one's upbringing in the religion of cruelty and hatred, his weak legal awareness or patriotic faith in the country, the stronger the passions of a person, example, cases of insanity, mass psychosis, or his evil will, example, the ferocity of a villain, the greater the likelihood that sooner or later a critical moment may come in which all psychospiritual means are exhausted. Finally, for the more mentally helpless, example, the deaf and mute, the foreigner who does not speak the language, one who is deprived of the gifts of speech, or the spiritually unarmed, example, cases of pedagogical inexperience, the unprincipled leader, a government's powerlessness in the absence of public support, integrity, or an honest press, it is more difficult to wage a struggle with purely spiritual means. We should note that establishing here once and for all a single meaningful criterion which would provide error-free solutions to such questions in every historical situation would be impossible. It is perfectly conceivable that a spiritually strong, wise, and experienced person will continue a psychospiritual struggle where a spiritually weak, inexperienced, and unskilled person will be inclined to declare that all spiritual means have been exhausted. But the reverse is also true. It may be the case that a spiritually strong and perspicacious person will turn to the sword where the weak, short-sighted, or stupid will persevere uselessly in trying to persuade and demonstrate. The struggle against evil is a living process, as complex as it is crucial, in which the evil itself is always given in the form of a single individual or social phenomenon. The task of the one who struggles against evil is always to comprehend the nature of this phenomenon in detail and find suitable means for overcoming it. Participating in this struggle, everyone must act according to the most extreme limits of his understanding, must be driven by love, must trust his spirit and rely on his observation. And no man, acting thus, can consider himself above possible errors, oversights, failures, and the potential for causing real harm. For man, even the most sincere and well-intentioned, is prone to make mistakes, and the greater the struggle, the more dangerous the methods he will be driven to. From error and harm, no one is guaranteed immunity. Neither in refraining entirely from the struggle, for it probably harms by encouragement and indulgence, or resisting by purely spiritual measures, for if they prove to be irrelevant, they not only give the villain freedom of action, but at the same time profane and discredit the power and the sanctity of spiritual conversation. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, Matthew 7:6, or in resisting via external compulsion and suppression, because one can overestimate the power of the evil will and underestimate the power of spiritual compulsion. Everything that philosophical research can give us as a criterion for guidance when resisting evil is entirely reducible to a few relatively formal rules. First, the one who resists must develop a sensitivity and vigilance in order to recognize evil and to distinguish it from phenomena similar to it in appearance. This is gained only with time, only through the long moral and religious purification of the personal soul, and only through a personal and genuine spiritually meaningful life experience. Secondly, the one who resists must strive to comprehend the ways and laws that lead to the birth of evil in human souls, as well as all the techniques of inner victory that the great ascetics and righteous men have developed. Only those who master these laws and techniques will be able to correctly resolve all of the issues of social education which go beyond this point. Thirdly, in choosing the measures and means to deploy in a struggle, the one who resists must always mentally begin with spiritual means, descending to measures of external struggle only insofar as spiritual means prove to be impracticable, invalid, and insufficient. And even when the need for physical force is clear from the very beginning and must be carried out immediately, the one who resists must remember that this measure is non-independent, secondary, subordinate, and extreme. Fourthly, turning to physical force, the one who resists should always seek both mentally and practically the moment and condition under which physical force can be withdrawn without endangering the spiritual struggle, preparing the way for her and giving her its place. For with the correct conduct in the struggle against evil, all measures to counteract it, starting with appeals to self-government and the blessing of one's own enemy, and ending with the death penalty for the absolute villain, exist in a kind of inner organic connection of mutual support and submission to a single goal. Finally, fifthly, the one who resists must constantly keep tabs on the authentic, inner roots and motives of his personal struggle against evil, in the knowledge that on this depends the objective comprehension of the evil to be assailed, the mastery of the spiritual techniques of struggle, the choice of means, and the exercise of the struggle itself. Moreover, he must be aware that his personal righteousness and his resilience in the struggle depend on these things, and it is in them that victory or defeat is determined in the final analysis. While the first 4 rules should not cause any confusion after all we have said above, the 5th rule requires some in-depth analysis and justification.